Hello everyone, it's Petty Officer Merrill with Job Corps, and we are here to talk about ETAR GG terrorism. Now, this is the second of the videos in this ETAR, and what we're going to go over here, I have a list of things that we're going to go over in this particular video. And it's first, identify the stages of developing a counterterrorism strategy. Describe counterterrorism techniques an organization or facility can implement. Describe and explain the importance of techniques for counterterrorism security. Define weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. Describe device detection techniques when working with small packages, and identify procedures for immediate response, treatment, and long-term response. So those are things that we're going to touch on in this video. And so first of all, I think what we're going to do is we're going to go over some of the anti-terrorism strategies. Now, before I get started with that, let's kind of explain what that means. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but for those of you who just really aren't familiar with it, we talked early in the first video, terrorism is when either domestic or international terrorism, where people with a political or social agenda try to use violence or intimidation to get you to do whatever they want. So, for instance, if someone doesn't like professional football, I'm just going to use that as a simple, silly example. Well, if they can't get Congress to pass a bill that says, okay, we're going to eliminate football, then what they might do is literally bomb a football stadium. Now, what you do is create such fear that the people will no longer go to the game because they're scared of terrorism. So you created a physical act of violence, but now what you have is, in the name, terror. You've created terror. Now, let's say you bombed one stadium this weekend. Now, do you think anybody's going to go to another game in a different stadium the following weekend? So no, you've created a situation where people feel unsafe and thus an act of terrorism. So let's talk a little bit here about these anti-terrorism strategies. First, what we're going to talk about, in essence, defending against terrorism is no different from defending against any other types of threats. Even though terrorism is complex insofar as assessing the threat is concerned, the physical security planning process is the same as it would be for any other threat or situation. Physical security must always be planned in several stages. Okay, so I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's you just have to be planned and prepared. So, how do you prepare for something that might happen, that might be dangerous, that might be something that you're trying to avoid? Sometimes there's just no way to plan for everything. And you also have to take into consideration the cost and expense of planning something like this. So when you get to the point where you say, okay, here at Job Corps, we could have, 25 security guards on site at all times, bomb sniffing dogs, but you also have to weigh the cost and benefit analysis, saying, is it really worth it? Can we really afford to do all that stuff? So let's move on. The first thing, assets are identified. What has value to the organization? What has value that is strategic, monetary, or symbolic to terrorist groups or individuals? What assets can be used to attack other targets such as aircraft, weapons, chemical, flammable materials, and maybe food and things like that? Okay. The second thing, loss events are exposed. These are easily employed tactics that can be performed by a single individual and have a substantial impact on the organization. They include bombings or arson, assassination, kidnapping, and for fundraising. Now, I'm throwing that in there because they're saying basically kidnap somebody for, creating terror, fear, and also you kidnap them and you hold them for ransom, and then you get somebody to pay you to get them back, right? So then we also have sabotage of machinery, implanting computer viruses, or product tampering. Okay, so what we're talking about here is that terrorism could be any sort of thing that is just causing problems for someone else, right? For a company, for a large company. Not, it's not necessarily, although you can be arrested for terroristic threats. So it's not like, and that would be telling someone you're going to blow up their house or come shoot their family or something like that. That's a terroristic threat. You can be arrested for that. But in this particular thing, it's like, if they just come in and throw sugar in your gas tank, it destroys your engine. And, there's a form of sabotage, right? Or even worse, what we don't think about is, forget the physical stuff. If they break into your computer and destroy all of your records, here at Job Corps, we have a system for keeping track of everything. If someone was to hack into that and destroy all the information, it would really be harmful to the operation. All right, let's press on. Occurrence probability factors are assigned, such as certain high probability, moderately probable, and improbable. What we're talking about here is again, we talked about asset analysis, cost benefit analysis, and basically what would be the reason for someone to come and attack something that has no value or and the value might be to us, but when you look at things globally or in the United States, is any one factory, some factory that builds tires. If you conduct some form of terrorism, is that something that would be, you'd lose that factory, maybe even lose some production, and maybe you have a shortage on tires, but in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't necessarily be a high probability target. Okay. So, impact of occurrences is assessed. Direct replacement, indirect, loss of business, extra expenses, added fees such as advertising and room rentals, costs are identified. So what we're talking about here is, again, you blow up a hotel. It's not just about the terror you caused. Now you set the business back. They don't have a room. They have to get them fixed. So the cost of fixing them, will people come and rent those rooms? You lost the rent for those rooms for the time that you were under repair. So there's a lot of things that impact terrorism. It's not just fear, right? Okay. Lastly, countermeasures are selected. This can include the following risk management approaches. Risk avoidance, such as not operating in a hostile country or having a business operate that is prone to attack. Okay, so if you have a business, and if you remember, I don't hear about it much anymore, but it used to be if you wore a fur coat, activists would come and throw some red paint on your fur coat and ruin it. And what they're trying to do is say, hey, if you want to come out in public wearing that fur coat that you killed an animal for, then we're going to destroy the coat, so you'll quit wearing it. If you quit wearing it, then people quit buying it. If it's going to get destroyed, then people quit making it because there's no demand for it. So you see how that trickle-down effect. Now, that's not necessarily a terrorism thing, but it kind of shows you an example of how the trickle-down effect. It's like, hey, we'll destroy this. People won't want it anymore. If people don't want it anymore, then they won't manufacture it anymore. If they don't manufacture it, we solve the problem. You won't do what we don't want you to do because we use this type of strategy. Risk reduction includes targeting happening by patrols via locks, lights, barrels, and so on. In other words, what they're talking about is defending the target, making sure that that you have the proper security, lighting, places for to stop, let's say, a car bomber or something. Risk spreading involves having several facilities in different areas so that if one facility or a key executive is annihilated, the entire group is not crippled. So let's go back to our little analogy about a fur coat factory, right? So you don't want people wear fur coats, you can go bomb the fur coat factory. Well, if the fur coat factory was something more important than a fur coat, you might have 5 factories and you don't put them all in. You don't build one huge factory, right? You build 5 factories all across the world so that you can never completely destroy. By the time they get to the next one, you might have the old one back up and running, and so just basically spreading out the risk, right? Okay. These are all examples of strategies. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show you a little video, and in this video, it'll discuss some of the strategies, and it talks mostly because we don't have nearly the amount of terrorism here in the United States as there is in Europe, and I don't want to get into all the reasons why. I guess maybe we could talk about that, as a sidebar. But I think that these videos, they'll come from Europeans, and they're kind of discussing the things that they see, do, and how it all works. So we can listen to this video, and you'll see this guy's European, and they'll discuss it. Okay, so let's take a look at this video, and as I mentioned before, it'll give you a general idea of what, some counterterrorism ideas.
There are three factors that are particularly important when analysing terrorism and counterterrorism. First, the terrorist strategy. Second, what the terrorists actually want to achieve. And third, how to best fight them. Terrorism can be thought of as a strategy, as how some rational actors think about what their goals should be and how they best pursue them. If we think about terrorism as a strategy, perhaps the best analogy is one that my co-author Tom Parker has used. He calls terrorism political jiu-jitsu. The point of many terrorist groups is to try to exploit the strength of the state, to take the strength of the state and turn it against itself. Terrorists thus create a trap that many states walk into. Almost no democracies have fallen as a consequence of terrorism, but many have overreacted to terrorism and thus made terrorist groups stronger, more popular, and given them more recruits. Terrorist strategy, in a sense, involves setting a trap for the state, and states very often walk straight into it. The second main point is about the heterogeneity of terrorist groups. All these different terrorist groups have a range of different aims. Some want to overthrow political and economic systems, some want to become part of the political and economic systems and have their own state. But they have one thing in common. They all want to provoke the state to overreact. And it is surprising how often they succeed. And this takes us to the third point, which is how best to fight terrorism. In short, we have three different approaches to terrorism. See it as a crime, send in the police. See it as a security threat, send in the army. See it as part of a political problem, and send in the diplomats. Today, most counter-terrorist strategies employ an element of all three. I think it's fair to say that what most states are trying to achieve today in counter-terrorist strategies is robustness. It's a strategy that is tailored to the particular threat at hand, but that takes a long-term perspective rather than a short-term perspective. If we've learned anything from counter-terrorism over a century and a half, it's that there are no magic silver bullets. There are no quick fixes. It's almost impossible to defeat or annihilate a terrorist group. Today, most states and international organizations are approaching counter-terrorism policy by means which we might call containment. The idea is that you can fight it in the short term, you can try to prevent it, you can deal with the consequences of an attack, you can prosecute the perpetrators of an attack, but to some extent, states have to live with some level of political violence. Even if you can bring armed groups, terrorist groups, into peace processes, there will be dissidents who try and spoil these processes by carrying on violent campaigns. A key point is therefore that terrorism must be contained in the long term, but not necessarily defeated overnight. In fact, efforts to defeat terrorism overnight are often counterproductive because they involve strong, sometimes repressive measures that end up giving the terrorists more recruits and playing into the terrorist narrative. If there is one lesson that we can learn from the last 100 years of liberal democracies fighting terrorism, it is that they must not abandon the moral high ground. Terrorism is best fought within the rules of law by means linked to police and intelligence, and perhaps the most dangerous thing a state can do is to walk in to the trap set by terrorists by adopting quick, ill-considered, radical legislation in the wake of a terrorist attack, rather than thinking of it as a threat that must be contained both in the short term, the medium term, and the long term.
All right, there you go. Hang on a second here. Make sure this has a tendency to start by itself.
Armed groups, terrorist groups, into peace process.
Okay. So anyway, there you go. I think that will pretty much cover most of the terrorism stuff, but we will go over real quick before we end this a couple of what I would consider simple things. So, for instance, define weapons of mass destruction. Okay. So there are several things in weapons of mass destruction, and one of them would be there's obviously nuclear weapons. There's traditional weapons that are just bombs that are high explosives and blow up. Traditional ordnance. Then there's chemical munitions, right? What chemical munitions are, more commonly known as a dirty bomb, would be like white phosphorus, and white phosphorus is a nasty thing. What happens is it burns super hot and super bright until it's deprived of oxygen or burns itself out. And the problem is it doesn't burn itself out very quickly. So what happens is it sends this fragmentation all over the place. So the bomb blows up, and then when it hits you, like it burns so much, it'll embed itself into your skin, and it just keeps burning. If you've ever messed with a match before, the tip of a match it gives you an idea. And I actually did this one time. As a kid, I thought I'd be funny, and I took a match and I just broke the tip off. And I thought I would do like this and flick it off the box, and it would just go flying and just be like, But when I did this, it just stuck to my thumb. And then I did this to put it out, and I burned a hole in both of my fingers. Stupid, right? But same concept. So with white phosphorus, you can get hit with a piece of white phosphorus. You can jump in the water and be like, oh, it went away. Then when you climb out of the water, it'll catch fire again. So it's really nasty. But then there are chemical nerve agents. Okay, nerve agents are it affects your central nervous system. And I'm gonna try to be really quick and concise with this. But basically, for your arm to do this and this, you have two muscles. You have your bicep and your tricep. Your brain tells your muscle to secrete a chemical that contracts this muscle and relax this one, and your arm does that. Okay, so then to straighten your arm out, your brain tells your body to secrete a chemical that tightens this muscle, your tricep, and relax this one, and then your arm does that. And that's the basic function of just about every muscle in your body. Well, these chemicals disrupt your brain's ability to tell your body controlling the secretion of these chemicals, and you end up just, if you've ever gotten a Charlie horse or a cramp, your body's just cramping up. And then if you think about it, it's very painful. If you think about it, what is your heart? Your heart's a muscle. So if your heart's beating and a nerve agent affects you, then your heart could just say, and you're dead. So what they do is on the battlefield, there's atropine and 2-PAM chloride. One of them, it is a counteraction to the nerve agent, and the other one is just basically a muscle relaxant. And what happens is if you get hit with a nerve agent, they come in these little tubes, and the tube has a needle in it. So basically it just looks like a tube, but if you hit it and basically you'll jam it into your thigh, then a needle pops out and so the problem is that it just is a big muscle relaxant, right? So now you're laying on the battlefield after you've been hit with a chemical, and you're just like, and you're just laying there on the ground, you can't move, but at least you're not dying, right? And so the 2-PAM chloride would counter that to let you somewhat come back to normal. But all these things, it's more of an emergency save your life thing, and not so much like, hey, I'm going to be fine after all this happens. You put all these chemicals in your body and adverse things happen. So, but these types of bombs are illegal. That there's a thing called the Geneva Convention, right? And there are agreements that one country won't use that on another country. I don't care. You can say, well, you're in a war and war is hell, and you're fighting. But there are some rules of engagement that the international community says, hey, you want to fight, that's your. But if somebody uses this, then you've just become a war criminal, and other countries will step in and attack the country that is using that and try to basically unseat you. So it's generally the more poor countries that use these type of bombs and munitions because it's unsafe, but it's definitely very dangerous. And you can imagine if that somebody unleashed some of that on New York or some populated city. Another thing is biological bombs and munitions and chemicals, and basically you have the that's what many think that the coronavirus was made in a laboratory and released, right? So that would be the example of a biological weapon. Basically, let's say you want an airport. You want to take over the enemy's airport. Well, you can come in there with a bunch of planes and drop bombs and kill everybody, and then what you have is a destroyed airport. But what if you could hypothetically drop the flu down there and everybody got sick and 24 hours later they were dead? Then you come in, you have a fully operational, airport ready for use, right? But the problem is those things aren't easily contained, and two, you end up dropping something and it mutates. Nothing stays the same, right? And it mutates into something, and you no longer have the antidote for it or the vaccine for it. And the next thing you know, it's killing you. So frowned upon. That's a soft word. They are not allowed to do that. And if you do it, you get in huge trouble by the international. I don't know, they're international agencies that just say that's wrong. And if you do it, we're going to come in and stomp you out. So. Those are things that, again, you say, well, if they could stomp me out, but what if it was the United States? Well, the United States doesn't use those kind of weapons. So they use more traditional weapons. And so it's usually the poorer countries that if the United States or, bigger countries have to go in there, they have the ability to say, we were letting you fight your little war out, but now we're stopping it because of what you're doing and it's inhumane and what have you. So they stop that. Let's see. I mentioned to you about how to counteract biological and chemical, nerve agents and stuff like that. But you also want to make sure that you have a well-trained staff of people, medical, know the phone numbers for 911. Well, you know what I mean? Like have the numbers to your fire department, your medical staff. You have people trained. You have first aid equipment available. In the event that something happens, that you can at least have the minimal amount to help somebody out and temporarily help them until professional medical people come on board. So these are the things that in the second half of ETAR GG, Introduction to Terrorism, we want to make sure that you understand and you feel competent in. And there is my lecture. So 2 videos on anti-terrorism, terrorism, and I hope you enjoyed it. So for Job Corps, I'm Petty Officer Merrill, and we'll talk to you on the next lesson.